Crossing the Bar by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson was born on August 6, 1809 in England. He is one of the most well-loved and popular Victorian British poets. Tennyson showed an early talent for writing and love for language. He wrote a 6,000-line epic poem at the age of 12 and was tutored by his father in classical and modern languages. However, Tennyson had a disturbed family life, as his father succumbed to alcoholism and mental breakdown. One of his brothers was sent to an asylum, while another was an opium addict. These experiences from his life influenced his writings. Themes like madness and insanity, grief, social issues, concerns with nature, and avarice were predominant in his poems. In 1827, Tennyson escaped home to attend Trinity College, Cambridge. In that same year, he published poems by two brothers with his brother Charles. From then on, Tennyson gained recognition and popularity for his poetry. At the age of 41, Tennyson had established himself as the most popular poet of the Victorian era. In 1850, he was selected as the Poet Laureate in succession to Wordsworth. He held the position until his own death in 1892, the longest tenure of any laureate. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. Some of his famous works include The Charge of Light Brigade, In Memoriam, Tithonus, and Ulysses. Crossing the Bar was written in 1889, 3 years before Tennyson's death. He was 80 years old then. He was visiting Isle of Wight and was suffering from a severe illness. Isle of Wight is an island in England. His condition made him ponder over life and death. Crossing the Bar is considered as an elegy written by Tennyson. Elegy is a serious reflection or a poem expressing sorrow or praise for the dead, usually a lament for the dead. The poem focuses on the transience of life and the finality of death. Transience refers to a state or quality of lasting for a brief or a short time. This poem is also considered to be a metaphorical meditation on death, which means that the poem is conveying thoughts related to death using metaphors. Meditation refers to constant thoughts expressed in form of speech or writing, in this case through poetry. In Crossing the Bar, Tennyson is contemplating his own impending death. The image of the sea is used to represent the barrier between life and death. Another central image is of the sandbar, bar which is metaphorically presented in the poem. A bar is physically a bar of sand in shallow water. Crossing the bar could be interpreted to mean crossing the sandbar out into the sea, transitioning from life into death. The speaker is comparing dying to gently crossing the sandbar between a coastal area and the wider sea. The sandbar is the border that separates life from death, and the sea is metaphorically compared to death. Let us focus on the structure and style of the poem, as these are the important features of Victorian poetry. Crossing the Bar is written in free verse. Tennyson has used 4 rhyming stanzas in the poem. Each stanza consists of 4 lines, which makes it a quatrain. Quatrain is a stanza of 4 lines, usually with an alternate rhyme scheme, which is followed in this poem. A traditional rhyme scheme of A-B is observed in the poem. The first and the third line rhyme in all the stanzas, and the same is true of the second and fourth line. The 16 lines of the poem come together to rhyme A B, C D, E F, G A, The last quatrain shares a semblance in rhyme scheme with the first stanza. The poem uses the first person narrator. It is exemplified in the use of the pronouns me and I in stanza 1. I is also used in stanza 3 and 4, while our, me and my are used in stanza 4. Crossing the Bar is a personal poem and it discusses personal feelings about death and dying. The use of the first person makes the message in the poem vivid and direct. Another interesting observation is in the arrangement of the lines in each stanza. The first and the third lines are outward, while the second and the fourth lines are pushed inward. This creates the image of a tide along with the use of the words like sea and boundless, which is in sync with the marine imagery as we can notice. The poem relies heavily on marine imagery to create this idea of death as a journey from one side of the sandbar to the other side, which is the vast open sea. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no mourning of the bar when I put out to sea. Tennyson opens the poem with the wider imagery of the sea and shore which is metaphorically presented in the poem. The phrase sunset and evening star suggests an end, immediately placing the reader in a setting at the end of the day. The metaphorical image can be extended to represent a later stage in the speaker's life. The evening star that is described is another name for Venus. Similar to the swift movement of Venus, the poet implies at the journey of life that is finally coming to rest with death. Poet uses alliteration in the second line, clear call. This clear call for the speaker is perhaps from his maker, suggesting an end to his life. Clear call refers to the nautical imagery, meaning related to navigation or the sea. A marine term which refers to the announcement for the sailors and seafaring men to set out. This literal meaning of the call is combined with the symbolic significance of the impending announcement of the poet's departure from the present world to the next. So the poem should be analyzed with its literal as well as the metaphoric meaning. The first stanza literally presents the voyage of a ship at sunset. A clear call is for the sailor to venture out to the open sea. The sailor wishes to have a cheerful farewell and no mourning when his ship crosses the sandbar that separates the harbour from the sea, and he embarks on his journey. Metaphorically, the poet means the speaker wants a gentle transit from life to death as he has reached the sunset of his life, and there is a clear call from his maker indicating God. He wishes to depart peacefully and cheerfully without mourning. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. In the second stanza, the speaker wishes for a tide that is full, which can carry him smoothly and peacefully towards his death. A full tide indicates peaceful transition from life to death. A full tide will ensure that his journey is not interrupted by sound or foam, and the journey from life to death is a solemn journey which is supposed to be a quiet return. It is only the high tide which will submerge the sandbar and allow him to move towards the sea, bearing him across the sandbar towards the ocean. The phrase "turns again home" depicts the waves as originating from the boundless ocean, briefly touching the shore, only to return to the depths of the ocean, indicating eternity. The unknown eternity of the boundless deep is the home for the soul, which must cross the bar to reach there. The Christian notion of the ephemeral nature of life and the eternal afterlife is presented to the readers in these lines. Ephemeral means transitory or short lived. The imagery of the deep water currents that begin from the depth of the sea and returns symbolizes circle of life and death. Tennyson's strong belief in religion is evident in this stanza. The poet allegorically relates a sailor's journey to the journey of the soul. Literally, the sailor of the ship wishes for a high tide to begin his journey. A high tide will ensure a smooth transition for his ship from the harbor to the sea. High currents that originate from the deep sea will smoothly drift his vessel to the deep waters. Metaphorically, the speaker prays for a peaceful transition from life to death. High tide metaphorically represents a smooth passage from life to death, eliminating noise or hardships. There shall be no sound of weeping or grieving that makes it difficult for the speaker to embrace death. Tennyson uses religious undertone in the last line of the stanza by presenting the ideas of life, death, and afterlife. The soul turns home again hints at the Christian belief of eternity of soul and its fleeting journey. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. This stanza helps to create a visual picture of the twilight. The transition from twilight to the darkness of the night is presented in this stanza. The evening bell is also symbolic to the death knell. The use of evening bell evokes images of the funeral toll often associated with death. A death knell is ringing of a church bell immediately after death to announce it in the neighborhood. The evening bell signals the death with the line, and after that the dark. Do observe the passage of time from sunset and evening star of the first stanza to the twilight and evening bell in this stanza. Time has passed by since the speaker began the poem, and time is passing by as he speaks. Readers are a part of his journey as we witness the movement of time and the speaker. The speaker reiterates that he hopes that there will be no sadness of farewell when his time is up. Speaker's death and passing to the other side is referred to as embarking. Tennyson maintains the nautical theme and imagery of the poem by using the term embarking. Tennyson unfolds the experience of life as an adventure that comes to an end with death, which is a serene and beautiful journey back home. If we look at the literal meaning of this stanza, the sailor has crossed the sandbar by embarking and venturing out to the sea. It is the time of twilight that is signaled by an evening bell. An evening bell literally refers to the ship's bell. It is a bell on a ship that is used for the indication of time. The sailor reveals that he does not wish to have a woeful farewell. Metaphorically, the speaker has crossed the sandbar by embracing death. Twilight and darkness symbolize death. He has reached the eternal sea of afterlife, and a death knell has indicated this passage. Tennyson's personal choice of a peaceful farewell can be observed in this stanza as the speaker states, "No sadness of farewell during his death." For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. Speaker's positive attitude towards death is exemplified in the final stanza of the poem. The prominent concept of time and space is noticed when he says that he will go beyond the boundaries of time and space, and the flood, meaning the high tide, will carry him towards his afterlife. He will go beyond the reach of the mortal world. The speaker is hopeful that there is a time and space beyond the realms of the earth where he hopes to go after his death. Readers are acquainted with the poet's strong belief in afterlife. Tennyson's reference to religion and God is evident by the use of capitalized letter in the word pilot. Speaker hopes to meet his maker, who is compared to a pilot steering his life and taking him home. Interestingly, the use of the word crossed might hint at Christ. The poem thus ends on a positive note, with the poet accepting the finality of death and hoping to meet God in the afterlife. The speaker's departure is simply moving from one life to afterlife, which is vast, open, and boundless like the sea. The idea of a peaceful death and meeting God evokes a sense of serenity in the minds of the readers. Do note how Tennyson contradicts the common perception of death as a painful experience and presents it to the readers as an inevitable yet soothing experience. The literal interpretation of this final stanza would mean that the sailor has moved away from the boundaries of land and the harbour. The ship is at the sea, far from the boundaries of time and space of the land. High tide has made this movement possible for the ship. The sailor wishes to meet his pilot, a reference to a skilled mariner who will guide him and steer his ship. Metaphorically, the speaker has accepted his death and enlightens the readers about the boundless quality of death and afterlife. The speaker has escaped the mortal world that is bound by time and space. It is here that he will meet his pilot. The poet equates the pilot with God, who will steer him towards his afterlife. The three prominent themes of the poem are death and dying, immortality of soul, and unflinching faith in God. Death is inevitable. Tennyson preaches his readers to accept death and embrace it instead of fearing it. Death must not be seen as a fearful experience, rather, it should be seen as a new beginning. The poet presents death as a part of the cycle of nature that is created by God. It is only a matter of time and transition. Crossing the bar is imbued with an undertone of religious teachings. Tennyson illustrates his belief in afterlife and immortality of the soul in crossing the bar, as he opines that death frees the soul from the mortal world only to enter the boundless, infinite afterlife. Soul does not cease to exist. It only journeys between different worlds. He explains this by comparing the journey of the soul to the waves in the sea that originate from the depth, reach the shore, and return to the deep sea. Similarly, the soul follows the cycle of life, death, and afterlife. Crossing the Bar is an apt example of Victorian poetry. It not only incorporates the theme of death, but it also attempts to reinforce people's faith in religion that was otherwise dwindling during the Victorian age. Tennyson uses religious allusions and connotations in the poem to remind his readers of the supreme and divine power of God who directs and controls every soul, similar to a pilot. He fulfills the duty of a poet laureate by alluding to the idea of meeting God after death and stressing on the significance of God and religion for the sake of the Victorian society.